Have you ever stood in front of a completely frozen or crying kid and just thought, what in the world is actually going on in your head right now? Well, if you're a parent or an educator, I'm sure you have. So let's jump right into this explainer and become behavioral detectives. Today, we're going to completely decode the neuroscience behind childhood distress, and specifically, we're going to unpack the massive, and I mean massive, difference between fear and anxiety.
So, is your child afraid or are they anxious? We kind of use these words interchangeably all the time, don't we? But here's the catch. Mislabeling a child's distress can actually lead to completely ineffective support. Seriously, if you try to treat an anxious kid with tools meant for fear, or vice versa, you might accidentally just make the whole situation worse.
Here is our roadmap for today. We'll be looking at 1. The core difference. 2. Inside the threat brain. 3. State versus trait. 4. Spotting it in kids. And finally, 5. Targeted interventions.
All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, the core difference, present versus future threats.
We absolutely have to start by busting the myth that fear and anxiety are the same thing. They are entirely distinct emotional states. Fear is like, boom, right now. It's an immediate, acute reaction to something present. You see a snarling dog, you feel fear. And as soon as that dog is gone, the fear just dissipates. Anxiety, on the other hand, is this diffuse, future-oriented state. It's an ambiguous apprehension. It's worrying that you might see a dog on your walk tomorrow. There's zero immediate danger, but that distress, it just persists.
So here is the absolute kicker. Anxiety actually requires cognitive elaboration. It requires a brain mature enough to play the what-if game, What if I fail my test? Or what if the other kids laugh at me? While fear is this deeply ingrained reflex that protects us right this second, anxiety basically loops us into anticipating a threat that might literally never arrive.
Now, regardless of the trigger, both can set off the body's physiological defense cascade. Heart rate spikes, breathing gets shallow. But I really want to point out that second bullet point, freeze. So many times we adults see a frozen kid and think, oh, they're just ignoring me or being defiant. No way. It's attentive immobility. It is an incredibly rapid, automatic preparatory state where their nervous system is frantically deciding whether to fight or flee.
Moving right along to Section 2, Inside the Threat Brain, the neuroscience of distress.
This is where the science gets wild. Neuroscientist Joseph LeDoux proposed a two-system framework, showing that our brains essentially have two totally separate tracks for handling threats. There's a buried automatic threat detection circuit, and then a higher-level conscious circuit that actually produces the feeling of being scared. Meaning, the body's defense circuit can hit the panic button and flood a child's system with adrenaline before they even consciously know they are afraid.
Building on that, Tavote's neurobehavioral perspective maps this right onto the brain's hardware. Fear is basically your amygdala firing a rapid response fire alarm. It's quick and intense. Anxiety, though, recruits a much broader cortical network, involving the BNST and the prefrontal cortex, to maintain a prolonged state of worry. Think of fear as a sudden alarm bell, and anxiety as a lingering, gloomy weather system.
Actually, scratch that clean binary for a second, because to give you the fully nuanced picture, it's not always a perfect split. Researchers like Raber and colleagues point out there's substantial neural overlap. They suggest these states exist on a dimensional continuum of threat imminence. Basically, the closer the threat is, the more it looks like pure fear. The further away it is, the more it looks like anxiety. Which brings us to Section 3, State versus Trait, momentary reactions versus baseline profiles.
Beyond just a momentary jump scare, we have to look at a child's baseline personality profile. As Silvers and colleagues demonstrated, if a kid has high trait fear, they are super reactive to sudden startles. Their amygdala is on a hair trigger, making them prone to specific phobias like a terror of thunderstorms. But a kid with high trait anxiety has a baseline of constant attentional bias. They're basically always scanning the horizon waiting for the other shoe to drop, prone to generalized worry.
Okay, Section 4. Spotting it in kids, the developmental shift.
Let's bring this out of the lab and into the living room. Kids' fears shift predictably over time. Infants and toddlers have concrete, sensory-driven fears, like loud noises. Preschoolers get into imaginary fears, like monsters under the bed. By early school age, it becomes more realistic, like a fear of getting physically hurt. And by the teenage years, their advanced cognitive abilities unlock abstract existential anxiety. They graduate from fearing the dark to fearing social evaluation.
Notice how beautifully this maps out. For toddlers, it's a purely fear-based profile.
But as formal operational thinking develops around age 11, we see this massive transition from amygdala-driven fear to prefrontal-driven anxiety. Which means, as they grow, our interventions have to graduate from simple behavioral exposure to much more complex cognitive restructuring.
Let's normalize things for a second with a pretty wild number. 74%, almost 3/4 of 4 to 6-year-olds report fearing imaginary creatures. This is completely normal. Researchers call it an imagination-reality leak because their prefrontal cortex hasn't totally mastered the boundary between fantasy and reality yet. So if your 5-year-old is convinced there's a monster in the closet, you can breathe a sigh of relief. It is not an anxiety disorder, it's just normal brain-appropriate fear.
And finally, Section 5, Targeted Interventions, Choosing the Right Tool.
This is the big payoff. Here is your exact playbook as a behavioral detective. Step 1 is to trigger a specific thing or an ambiguous concept. Step 2, are they reacting to right now or something in the future? Once you answer those, Step 3 is to match your treatment to either the amygdala's fear circuit or the prefrontal cortex's anxiety network.
Because you literally cannot just logic a young kid out of a pure fear amygdala response. Their higher brain is essentially offline in that moment. You need behavioral exposure. But if it's anxiety, exposure alone won't cut it. You absolutely have to challenge those what-if thoughts through cognitive restructuring because the distress is being fueled by their own thoughts, not just the environment.
For specific fears, exposure therapy is a total game changer. It's a gradual, safe confrontation with the feared object. Modern neuroscience shows us that exposure doesn't just erase a fear memory. It actually teaches the brain a brand new safety memory through something called inhibitory learning. It literally proves to the child's brain that the bad thing they expect to happen simply does not occur.
But for anxiety, cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, is the absolute gold standard. It pairs that behavioral exposure with vital cognitive restructuring to short-circuit those worry loops. You're teaching the kid to act as a detective of their own mind, identifying catastrophic thoughts like everyone's going to laugh at me and replacing them with realistic facts. You're actively engaging their prefrontal cortex to hit the brakes on the emotional distress.
This framework is the whole foundation of tools like the fear-me-not approach, which safely gamifies these kinds of interventions. Honestly, it is so reassuring for parents to realize their child is usually just dealing with a normal, adaptive, age-appropriate fear rather than a complex clinical issue like generalized anxiety disorder. When you target the specific fear with the specific, correct tools, kids can overcome it with amazing resilience.
Knowing the difference between an immediate amygdala-driven fear and a future-oriented prefrontal anxiety is absolutely the first step to conquering both, because once you know the circuit, you know the cure. So what clues will you look for the next time distress strikes your home or classroom? Listen for those what-ifs, pay attention to the triggers, and get ready to empower the kids in your life to conquer their distress for good.